Yeah, that's right. Paulogia. I was about to mention actually.
Right.
Paulogia. Yeah. Such an amazing coincidence.
That is an amazing coincidence. I was just about to mention me too. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, why not take a second to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, and news videos come out. Possibly my favorite topics to research and discuss on this channel are those surrounding the alleged resurrection of Jesus. So I was excited to see a theologian attempting to take on an element of naturalistic hypotheses.
Andrew Loke is associate professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's the author of Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. That book is linked in the description of this video. One of the coolest things about this is that it's free. You can actually just go get it right now and download it for free on Kindle.
Which I definitely took advantage of. And it was helpful having the book on hand to clarify Dr. Loke's rapid overview in this video. For those who are inevitably going to ask, no, I didn't speed up Andrew at all. This is how fast he talks all the time. The scope of this interview wasn't the entire resurrection case, but instead a tight focus on refuting the skeptical idea that the explanation for the data we have could involve hallucinations. But before jumping into the standard amateur analysis of neuroscience, I was incredibly impressed that Dr. Loke acknowledged why that's not the first step.
Before we address the hallucination hypothesis, right, we need to ask ourselves, how many people actually experience something, right? How many people actually experience something? So was it only one or two, or was it quite a lot of people, right?
Exactly. Those familiar with my How Christianity Probably Began, No Resurrection Required video will know that I put forth a case that only Peter and Paul need to have believed they had experiences, and whatever theirs was would have been years apart.
Paulogia thinks that, well, it wasn't even 3 or 4, it was maybe only 2, right? Peter and Paul, right?
Yeah.
And he thought that Peter and Paul had hallucination, right?
If I'm right about this, then the concept of mass hallucinations never has to enter play. I'll say that again. The possibility or likelihood of mass hallucination is irrelevant until such time as the apologist can demonstrate that multiple people saw something. I've asked some of the top resurrection scholars in the world to do so. Can Dr. Loke be first?
Paulogia responded to 1 Corinthians 15 by saying that, well, he likes to use the phrase, "cause the Bible tells me so," right? Okay, that 1 Corinthians 15 is taken from the Bible, right? And so are you Christians saying that, just because the Bible says so, therefore it's true, right? Of course, right? The skeptics would not accept this easily, right?
Like many before him, Dr. Loke misunderstands my use of the "for the Bible tells me so" jingle. It is absolutely not to say that something in the Bible can't or shouldn't be believed. It is simply and entirely to point out that the argument being made is from a single source.
Now, my response is, we have to look at documents in the New Testament from a historical perspective. So we can treat them like letters that people wrote to another person.
Yes, I know the Bible is actually 66 individual books, but those paying attention will note I make this point when the claims originate in only one of those. I tell you what, I'll retire "for the Bible tells me so" if Dr. Loke provides any documentary evidence in this video that originates from outside the Bible. How's that for raising the stakes?
So when we read the letters of the early Christians, we can know what is it that they believe.
Yes, I'd accept that by reading the letters we can get a good idea of what the author believed. The question I'm concerned with is, did the author believe something that was true?
We need to read the letters with a certain degree of common sense, right? Common sense. And this common sense is very important because sometimes I find it quite lacking in some of the skeptics, the way they argue their case.
Since you just mentioned me by name, I have to assume that I'm one of the skeptics that Dr. Loke thinks is lacking common sense in my arguments. While I'll go on record as saying that I'd be thrilled for the opportunity to have a conversation with Andrew sometime, it's clear that he's not going to be persuaded by me and my lack of common sense. But that's okay, because at the same time this video was released, there was also a 4-part series happening on Christian Bible scholar Mike Licona's channel, interviewing fellow Christian Bible scholar Dr. Dale Allison on his upcoming book about the resurrection.
Dale Allison is the Richard J. Dearborn Professor of New Testament Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's got a new book coming out, Resurrecting Jesus. It's called Arguing Resurrection, Apologetics, Criticism, History.
Unfortunately, Dr. Allison's book isn't out yet, and it won't be free. I've actually recently created an Amazon wish list for the channel, mostly with Christian books that I'd like to read and cover on the channel. If anyone's interested in supporting my efforts that way, the link's in the description.
I think if all the New Testament scholars in the world were polled and asked to name who they think, in their opinion, are the top 5 New Testament scholars in the world, I think the name Dale Allison would appear on those lists more than any others. You are so transparent. You are authentic. I think you make a real concerted effort to get to truth rather than to support any kind of a worldview. And I just want to say I find it extremely rare in New Testament studies to find someone as honest and is seeking truth to the extent that you do. And I really admire that with you.
Since Dr. Loke's book references Dr. Lycona's work at least 14 times, and Dr. Allison's prior work at least 10 times, I trust that these men would be up to Andrew's standards of common sense on biblical matters. And as such, I'm going to say as little as possible, and let these and other experts respond to what Andrew puts forth. No one wants to hear from a total loser like me.
For me, it's not a matter of the skeptical historian being a total loser because they can come up with some sort of naturalistic hypotheses to account for the same data as I would within the resurrection hypothesis.
Oh, well, thank you, Mike.
The skeptical historian has an out without being a total loser because their explanations aren't as implausible as I may think.
Well, let's see why Dr. Loke thinks they're implausible.
And so, when we read 1 Corinthians 15, right?
He's going to spend his whole time on this passage, so let's enter that into the record.
For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born.
And there is good reason why seasoned apologists stick to this single passage.
You say the following, and let me quote, "In my judgment, which is hardly idiosyncratic, not a single canonical gospel was penned by an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. This leaves, when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, Paul as our sole first-hand source. In his extant correspondence, however, he says next to nothing concrete about his inaugural vision of Jesus, nor does he offer any details about Jesus' tomb or events associated with it. The only Pauline passage to offer details about the resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, much of which is the composition of someone whose identity escapes us. In the end, then, how much reliable historical data from early eyewitness sources against which later claims can be critically compared and ascertained do we truly have?" End quote.
Dr. Allison doesn't think there's much to be gleaned from this passage, but Dr. Loke is hanging his hat on it.
There are 6 considerations for thinking that what Paul's saying is true, right? They were indeed these people, and that these people did claim and did experience something which they thought was the resurrected Jesus. Okay.
The historical fact that must be explained is that people believed they had the experience, not that they actually had it. This is a big problem already, but carry on.
The first thing we need to pay attention to is the fact that Paul is writing to people, some of whom were skeptical about the resurrection.
The already converted members of the Christian church in Corinth were skeptical about the resurrection?
Now, I'm going through this very quickly, right? I give far more details in my book.
Well, when I read this section from your book, I see you reference a Corinthian dispute about the nature of how normal humans will be raised in the last days. But in that verse, Paul appeals to their common belief in Jesus' resurrection to anchor his point in resurrection theology. They agree about Jesus. Then you have examples of more and less rigorous epistemological standards and a spectrum of resurrection philosophies from ancient times and places that aren't Corinth in 55 AD, as addressed in the letter. Pointing out that not everyone believed Christian claims doesn't demonstrate that those who did accept it had rigorous reasons to believe. Some skeptics of UFOs come to believe in alien abduction. That doesn't imply that they had epistemologically sound reasons for doing so. And I might just as well appeal to the non-believers of the time and insist that they were the ones who were intellectually rigorous about checking the available evidence for resurrection claims, finding it wildly insufficient. So their conclusions were correct. But let's move on. Granting that some Christians might have wanted more supporting proof than others is relatively trivial.
And by the way, these 6 considerations, right, we have to take them together, right? It's not just one, we shouldn't take it separately, right? But we should consider all 6 considerations together.
Yes. The cumulative case plea of the resurrection apologist. I'll just say that the pieces have to have merit individually before they can be considered within a collective picture. Quantities of 0 don't accumulate, no matter how many you add.
The second consideration is that we know that this is a life and death issue, right, for the early Christians, right? Because Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He says, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile, right?
Sure, the resurrection of Jesus is an important doctrine. Let's grant that and move on to...
The early Christians were prepared to give up their life. Right? They were for their faith, right? So this is a life and death issue.
Oh no, Andrew. We were almost moving on. And then you casually slip in an allusion to martyrdom defense. I'm trying to let your favorite Christian sources do most of the talking, so I'll throw to Dr. Sean McDowell.
I think there's also been a hyper trust by many Christians who read martyrs and says, hey, they all died as martyrs, and they proclaim it. Well, I've made that claim in the past, so I repent on this show from making that before I did my research. That should be corrected as well.
Andrew is attempting to establish exactly who and how many actual witnesses to resurrected Jesus there are, and in particular that it's more than 2 to 4 people.
People will not be willing to sacrifice for what they knew is false, right? A lot of people will be willing to die for what they think is true, even though that may not be true. But you won't find groups of people, right, who will be willing to die, right, for what they know is false.
Here, Dr. Loke is affirming that he's saying that eyewitnesses specifically are the guarantors, not any second-hand believers. And yet, if we want to go down the evidence for persecuted preaching of actual eyewitnesses, how many does the Christian expert cited by Andrew think we have?
Of the 12, there's only 2 that we have very high confidence died, historically speaking. And that's Peter and James, a brother of John, James, son of Zebedee. The others, I'm not even sure we can know at all what history is or where legend begins.
This willing to die argument doesn't boost your eyewitness numbers. The evidence doesn't support it. Most of these so-called witnesses simply disappear from history. We have no idea what they were willing to do. Check my playlist for several videos on this topic, including my direct interactions with Dr. McDowell. Let me attempt to try to steelman Andrew, and say rather that because the Corinthians receiving the letter could have faced troubles by accepting the claims, even though outside of Rome at specific times, this claim too might not have that much merit. They might have been cautious to do so. Maybe. Okay. As long as you're not attempting to bolster eyewitness numbers with martyr arguments.
The third consideration is that people can check out if there were indeed these eyewitnesses or not.
Okay. We're finally getting somewhere.
Right. So Paul claimed that there were 12 and then 500 and then another group. Now, the readers of his letters can easily verify if this is so.
So you take the appearance to the 500. You just ask any question and you don't know the answer. Who were these people? Were they in the south? Were they in the north? Were they in Galilee? Were they in Jerusalem? But what they saw, how many of these people knew Jesus really well? How did they see him? Really, how did they see him? 500 people, that's a lot. Now, it's got to be an approximation, but was there a receiving line? Was there a jumbotron? My point is that I don't know the answers to any of these questions. I can't name a single person who was there. Can't name a single person who was there. You can ask questions of these texts, and they turn out in many ways to be what I would call thin. They don't have thick descriptions, and they don't carry a lot of data with them. The 500 just isn't there.
And so Paul could never have said this and got away with it, right, if this is not true.
I've also told stories, and within a week heard someone else tell that story, and it's already morphing into something else. I remember being at Duke as a graduate student and hearing a legend about Dale Allison told me by somebody who knew me, being spread by people who were there when I was there. It was not true, but people were spreading this story. And the fact that I said that didn't happen, I'm sure it didn't stop the spread of the story, right? So recently, for example, I was asked to write a paper on Simeon Stylites. He's the weird fellow several centuries after the first century. There are 3 early biographies of this character, one written while he's still alive, but the one I'm interested in most was written within 14 years of his death. It was written by people who lived in his monastery or in the immediate area. It is full of information from eyewitnesses and people who knew Simeon. But the thing is, this comes from Simeon's time and place, and it's full of stuff nobody believes, but the author clearly believed. So when you run into things like that, and when you spend a lot of time with those texts, as I have, you're just less sanguine about eyewitnesses. Okay.
Well, because this is very early, right? This was Paul's letter was written very early. It is within 25 years after Jesus' crucifixion in around AD 30.
Whether documenting something 25 years after it allegedly happened is considered early is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose.
And in fact, Paul was passing on a tradition, right, which dates even before that. Right?
The feature of this passage that New Testament scholars like to point out is that Paul isn't writing it firsthand. He's simply repeating something that other people told him.
And that's why Paul says among the 500 over people, most of them remain until now, like in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 6. Right? Among these 500 people, most of them are still alive. Right? So Paul is actually saying that most of them are still alive and inviting the readers to check for themselves.
I just want to quibble for a minute that since Paul is repeating what others told him, Paul is not inviting readers to check for themselves. He's repeating someone else's invitation.
After he goes through this oral formula, this creed or whatever you may want to call it, in chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, and then verse 8, Paul adds his own testimony about Jesus appearing to him.
This bold, if you don't believe me, ask around stance doesn't come from the part Paul added. It comes from whoever gave this to Paul.
There's a difference between an inference, which is what you're making, and eyewitness testimony, which we do not have. And my point is that this is an inference, okay?
Okay.
But it's not eyewitness testimony.
Except for Paul.
Except for Paul. But again, he doesn't tell you a whole lot. Acts is much more interesting. Acts is much more interesting when it comes to Paul's conversion than Paul is.
If this is not true, then it's very unlikely, right? You'll be like me telling Cameron, that yesterday, hi Cameron, your wife told me yesterday that she was visited by Donald Trump, right? Of course, I wouldn't say this kind of thing, right? Because I know that you can easily check.
Well, it's too bad that Paul didn't write anything remotely close to that. If he had, maybe then I'd have a good reason to believe. No, the analogy would be, hi Cameron, someone I won't identify told me that they heard that in 1995, in an unidentified city, 500 people, whose names I will not tell you, saw Frank Zappa perform, even though he died in 1993. If you don't believe me, go ask them. Where would you start? How would you check it, even if you wanted to? What if we added in that there arose a Frank Zappa had a concert in 1995 club, where anyone who joined was treated well, given free food and clothing, and anyone who simply said they saw the concert was treated like a celebrity in the group? Might that encourage some to lie about being at the concert? Or even somehow convince themselves that they were? We'll talk more about this later.
And I have three other considerations, but I think I will stop here and move on, right? Because I think these are already enough to establish the conclusion, right? That
wrong. All you've said is that the resurrection was important to people, and they possibly could have fact-checked. Maybe. As of the time of this recording, 1/3 of Americans believe the 2020 election, held just a few months ago, was wrought with massive voter fraud that changed the results, while another third of Americans believe the election was entirely secure and accurate. No matter what the truth is, at least 1/3 of the most information-rich population in the history of the world is completely wrong about something highly investigatable and highly significant and important to them. That first-century Palestine, despite the handicaps of illiteracy, poor documentation, limited communication, proclivity for superstition, and relative immobility, was somehow magically immune from people believing false stories that could be checked, is laughable. You'll forgive me if I'm not yet convinced about this anonymous hand-me-down group appearance tradition. Again, in the spirit of steel-manning Dr. Loke, what are the remaining points from his book? The first point is actually just an outline of the others. The fifth is that Paul cared about his reputation, and so would have done some rigorous fact-checking before passing along this creed. That's an inference.
There's a difference between an inference, which is what you're making, and eyewitness testimony, which we do not have.
And sixth, that this 1 Corinthians passage is corroborated by other independent documents, particularly the Gospels.
You say here that you don't believe any of the Gospels, and of course, church tradition is that Matthew and John were written by eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke, there's no one that are saying Mark and Luke are eyewitnesses. And you reject the traditional authorship of Matthew and John. So you say they're not written by eyewitnesses.
And indeed, such descriptions of their experience were indeed multiply attested, right? In first century documents. I mean, you find this in the Gospel of Luke, we find this in the Gospel of John, and also in Acts, right?
If you have a modern trial, what do you want to have from the witnesses? You don't want them to have post-event contact. You want to have truly independent witnesses. As far as I can tell, on the traditional theories of authorship, all these people are talking to each other all the time, so they're not truly independent in any way at all.
In fact, none of the appearance stories are multiply attested. I go into this at length in my 5 Scholars Attempt My Resurrection What If Challenge video, but it's entirely uncontroversial to observe that no appearance story is repeated. That's why sophisticated scholars like Dr. Lycona have moved on to say that while there isn't multiple attestation of the appearances themselves, we might have attestation in motif or general theme.
Even if John and Matthew and none of the Gospels, even if it's the case that none of them are written by eyewitnesses, you do have multiple attestation of independent sources in terms of a motif.
I don't know what to do with what you call multiple attestation of a motif here. I do work with that method sometimes, but in the present case, I am no longer sure that John hasn't heard the Gospel of Luke. So I recently published an article explaining my repentance. And a number of years ago, I worked through the problem again, and I decided that John had at least heard, maybe who knows how many times. I don't think John writes with the other Gospels in front of him, but I do think John has heard Matthew, and I think he has heard Luke. And that means that multiple attestation with regard to Jesus eating or being touched may not be there. In other words, that may be something John is getting from Luke. But with regard to the physicality of the appearances, it makes sense to me that even if those things did not happen, it would not be unexpected to find them in the text because they serve apologetical elements. The importance of Jesus physically coming in the flesh is there in John's world. And in Luke, this serves an apologetical motif, that is, Jesus is not a ghost. And of course, that's one of the things people have always said. The disciples saw a ghost or they hallucinated or so on. And I would expect early Christians to come up with a counter to that at some point. So am I making myself clear here? There are motifs that repeat that are unexpected. And then there are motifs that don't surprise me. And the physical motif doesn't surprise me. And that's why I don't do much with it.
And also outside the Bible as well, right? So, for example, in the letters of Ignatius, right, it says that the disciples, Jesus eat and drink with them, right?
Here's where Dr. Loke might attempt to break my "for the Bible tells me so" challenge. But Ignatius is writing in the 2nd century, and obviously referencing the already written Gospels. He's not a witness to anything at all, and provides no new information to suggest that he has alternate sources. This is no more additional attestation to the actual events than your local pastor paraphrasing stories from the Gospel next Sunday. Sorry. If you want to know more about Ignatius, see my recent "Why We Know the Story of Jesus Isn't a Legend" response video.
No, and of course, when we read the writings of skeptics, skeptics think that, well, these are all embellishment, right? They think that this is probably not true. Now, my response is that if this was not true, we can't experience how is it that they would come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected.
Maybe if you would look at some other case at Mormonism, it would be helpful here. So I'm not a Mormon. I don't buy into the Mormon worldview, but when I try to explain early Mormonism, I have to explain several things. I have to explain Joseph's vision of the angel. I have to explain the golden tablets. I have to explain why an unlettered person could produce this book. I have to explain why 3 people swore they held the tablets, and why 8 others, saw them, and why this movement flourished even though, the odds were against it. So a Mormon would say, I think there's one explanation for all those things. God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. You could say God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. That explains all those things. Since I'm not a Mormon, I actually have 6 or 7 different explanations. It's a scattershot approach. I say, well, Joseph was of this character. This is how I explain the golden tablets, and so on and so on. So I don't think that's unreasonable.
I shall pause here and just conclude that on the basis of this evidence, we have good reason to think that there were indeed these. It was not just 2 or 3 people, right?
You absolutely do not. You are taking a single passage that did not originate with the author and are taking it at its word.
It's very hard for me to think of myself as a skeptic here, but I don't trust the details of the accounts the way you do.
We now then go on to think about the hallucination hypothesis, right?
For the sake of interest in epistemology, we can take a look at some of the things Andrew had to say about the hallucination hypothesis. But most of his points are going to be about group hallucinations, right down to using the same tired examples all the apologists use.
And hallucinations would be something like dreams, for example,
They happen
right? So
in
dream is something that is
individual
incremental.
minds.
So I
You can't wake your
my wife
spouse up in the
and say,
middle of
"Hey,
the night and say,
Dad,
honey,
I have a dream that I went to
Hawaii.
My wife.
Let's both go back to sleep. I have the same
Let's have a free
dream. We'll
vacation.
save all the airfare. We'll save all the
My wife would say, what?
You can't do that.
And since Andrew failed to demonstrate that there were any group appearances of any kind that need explaining, none of the established facts require a group hallucination.
People can tell the difference between what is hallucination and what is caused extramentally, right? They do know the distinctions, right? And they also believe in ghosts. They also believe in visions. They believe in such things.
I think these appearances were either, I'm hedging my bet, I say they are visions or vision-like. Vision or vision-like, because they do have things in common with visions. Jesus just is there. That's what happens in visions. He's just not there. That's what happens in visions. He pops in through a room. That's what happens in visions. People don't know who he is. That often happens in vision. Who is this? What is it? There is doubt. So there are visionary-like motifs. So if you want to, you go with Pannenberg and say originally these go back to visionary experiences, but I actually am hedging my bet. I say these are either visionary experiences or visionary-like experiences, which means I just don't know what the heck is going on. You're a Christian. You read the Bible. You know God throughout the Bible appears to people and communicates through visions. Acts actually calls Paul's experience a vision, right?
So in order to persuade these people that Jesus was actually bodily resurrected, right, there must have been some solid evidence of the physicality of Jesus' resurrected body, right?
He can cook for them. He can eat. They can touch him, converse with him.
So yeah, there we disagree. I don't know what happened, and I find it all very mysterious, and I have no idea what Jesus's post-resurrection ontological, metaphysical, bodily status is. By the way, did he have intestines? I don't want to say too much. I don't think anybody has any clue as to what Jesus's post-mortem body is like. I think most of us think that it was transformed into some other mode of existence, right? So where was Jesus between his appearances?
Yeah,
was he hiding in the bushes? Where was he? I don't think he was here. I think he was somewhere else. I think he's in a parallel universe or something really weird like that. And once you start talking about those sorts of things, you're in truly strange territory.
As I argued earlier on, they must have this kind of experience, right, in order to explain how they come to that conclusion.
So I think apologists need to revisit this.
We have good reasons, right, to totally reject the intramental hypothesis, which is utterly ridiculous, and to conclude that the disciples must have experienced something real, right? It must be a real person. It must have been a real person whom they experienced alive.
You absolutely do not need to have external stimuli in order to have an experience, or the false memory of having had an experience.
I also know that memory can falter and be inaccurate. And it's really been important to me once I started reading the cognitive science, scientific literature on memory.
Shannon Q introduced me to Elizabeth Loftus, one of the leaders in cognitive science literature on memory that Dr. Allison speaks of.
I study people who remember things that didn't happen or remember things differently from the way they actually occurred. What we do is we show people a simulated crime or an accident, and then we might try to deliberately feed them some misinformation about what they experienced. So they might see the car go through a yield sign, and we suggest to them that it's a stop sign. And what happens when people are exposed to this misinformation is sometimes they will adopt it as their own memory and become convinced of it. So they'll now tell you, I saw a stop sign. They might be confident about it and detailed about it, even though it's a distorted detail. Then what we did is to see just how far you can go with people. We tried to plant entirely false memories into the minds of people for things that didn't happen. And we were able, through the power of suggestion, to convince people, for example, that they were lost in a shopping mall when they were 5 years old, that they were frightened and crying and ultimately were rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family, all through the power of suggestion. So what these studies show, and not just studies done by me and my research collaborators, but many other scientists around the world, is that memory is malleable. It doesn't work like a video recording. And the take-home message from all this is that just because somebody tells you something with a lot of detail and confidence and emotion, it doesn't mean that it really happened.
That's just the tip of the iceberg, and I highly recommend you listen to one of her full talks. It's pretty shocking. Now, the fact that Dr. Loke flagrantly disregards false memory as a potential factor when it comes to resurrection experiences is almost unforgivable, but made even worse when he bases the rest of his conclusion on the notion that he has made a comprehensive study of all potential naturalistic factors and can quantify them.
So even if we are so generous to assign so high a probability to hallucination, mass hallucination, intramental hypothesis 0.1, even if we assign 0.1, right, to each naturalistic alternative, what we have here, when we add up all together the rest of the alternatives, and there are 6 of them, right? we add them up, right, it's only 0.6, right? And so the rest of the probability space will be taken up by the resurrection, right? So what this means is that we can conclude that the resurrection of Jesus happened with a probability of 99.4%, right? Even without having to assign a prior probability, right, to the resurrection.
Well, that sounds a lot like the famous line penned by Arthur Conan Doyle for his Sherlock Holmes character.
Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
But friend of the channel Matt Dillahunty has dubbed this typically faulty line of thinking Doyle's fallacy.
This poses a problem. How do you know that you've eliminated all other possibilities? If you're not very careful about defining your propositions and arguing in terms of direct negations, you are setting yourself up to be deceived. Doyle clearly thought that he was too smart to be fooled, and he was shown to be wrong repeatedly. He was a spiritualist, fascinated with mysticism and the occult. He believed in fairies, famously championing the Cottingley fairy pictures, which turned out to be cardboard cutouts of fairies stuck in a picture, and he thought that it was proof of the paranormal. Houdini would perform a trick and flatly tell Doyle, it's just a trick. And Doyle refused to believe them. And Houdini's purpose in doing this was to show Doyle that he is quick to leap to supernatural explanations when he merely doesn't know what the actual explanation is. Doyle's problem here is a version of the argument from personal incredulity fallacy, which was a mix of a failure of imagination, reaching conclusions with insufficient information, hubris, and a seemingly crippling fear of not knowing something or admitting that he didn't know something. Stop that. This problem, which for tonight, since we're renaming things, I will call Doyle's fallacy, just to make this simpler, is summed up in yet another quote from him. Any truth is better than indefinite doubt. And the skeptics in the room just cringed and died a little.
Dr. Loke is not only pulling numbers out of thin air, but he's arrogantly decided that the finite number of possible naturalistic explanations is somehow 6. Forget that we haven't even agreed to what facts need explaining in the first place. Forget that he spilled no ink on the incredibly obvious option that any eyewitnesses were merely mistaken, even though our non-exhaustive understanding of potential causes for memory failure fills volumes. Andrew destroys his idea of this elimination-style probability exercise when he admits himself that we cannot have an exhaustive list of explanations.
But he did not exclude all the possible alternatives. I mean, there could be various, maybe some other hypothesis that we have not thought of yet, right? So maybe there are other possible ways to explain away the evidence. Well, perhaps, right? Who knows, right? So
Dr. Allison warns about this line of thinking as he discusses the alleged sightings of the Virgin Mary by a lot of people in Egypt in 1968.
On the dome of this church, there was a figure of light. And this figure of light was seen by literally hundreds of thousands of people. The crowds were gigantic. And the crowds thought it was Mary. Now, this really happened. It's not a legend. It's not a myth. And the Coptic Orthodox authorities said, we think this is Mary up there. All right. So here's the problem. In this chapter, I talk about this event, and then I look at some of the explanations for it. One, of course, is that this is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Then there are some people who've tried to explain it in terms of earthquake, lights, fault lights, and all sorts of other options. And I give reasons why nothing makes any sense, okay? So I can draw lessons from this. My first lesson is that I believe that there are inexplicable events in the world, things that historians and reasonable people can look at and say, wow, I don't know what that is. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. That's one thing. The second thing I can do with this is I can say, well, this is actually a word of caution because I'm not sure how to explain this, but I think I know a lot more about these appearances than the appearances in the New Testament. Again, we have some photos. Maybe they've been doctored a little bit. I don't know, but we have some photos. We have tons of firsthand testimony. This is a real thing. It's real. And I don't know what to make of it. So that gives me some caution, given the abundance of testimony and the fact that I still don't know. Isn't that caution for the New Testament, about which we know no less? Looking at it from the point of view of a Coptic Christian, this is Mary, and anyone who doesn't see this is just blind. But I'm standing outside and looking at this and saying, you know what? This helps me understand the skeptic of the New Testament accounts a little better, because even though I don't have a story, I'm not willing to go there. This actually teaches me something about worldviews and how hard they are to break, how difficult they are to break. What's wrong with me? I think I'm being a little bit like the skeptic of the resurrection when I'm not willing to say, it's Mary. Come on, wake up. What's wrong with you?
So, of course, skeptics think that miracles are very unlikely. That's a common and that's a quite understandable objection, right?
I think the historian, or a certain type of historian, would say everything that I'm saying has parallels, whereas nothing you say has a parallel. For example, we know of empty tombs that were emptied because of people stealing bodies. And we do know that people hallucinate frequently. We also know from the study of messianic movements that people sometimes claim the fulfillment of prophecy when, to all appearances, it wasn't fulfilled. So everything in the skeptical explanation has parallels, whereas everything in yours is without parallel. I think the skeptical historian can still say, without being an imbecile and without being totally uninformed, yeah, I got a story here. And the odds against it are considerable, but his response to you is always going to be, but a guy rising from the dead, the odds against that are pretty good too, right? Mm-hmm. So you look at his story and you say, what's the likelihood of all that coming together? But he's going to look at your story and say, what are the odds of that? So that's perhaps where you and I part company here. I am not the skeptic, but I think the skeptic has a better argument than maybe you think, okay?
Now, if you've made it through all this, you might be wondering why I've bothered to put up Christian objections to Christian apologetics. It's because, like Dr. Lycona, Dr. Allison, and others I've presented, I'm just completely exhausted at bad arguments from the lay-level apologists. This video isn't meant to convince a Christian that Jesus didn't rise, but maybe, just maybe, it will convince them to drop some of their unsubstantiated arguments.
So the question I'm asking you here is, do you think Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay, so it's yes with qualifications, okay? And I could answer yes, sincerely, Dale Allison, right? But that would be unilluminating. Why is that unilluminating? Because it doesn't really matter what I think. All that matters is my reasons for thinking what I think. So from my point of view, in this context, I am nothing but my arguments. I am nothing but my arguments, no more, no less. If my arguments are good, then pay attention to my arguments. If my arguments are bad, well, then too bad for me. Origen was right. Origen, in his commentary on John, somewhere says, one of the hardest things to do is to show that something happened, even if it did happen. Even if it happened, you can't always give the reasons to show that it did.
How do you deal with this? And it's like, well, okay, if I can use the arguments and my findings in Christian apologetics, then that's great. But if I can't, well, that's fine with me too. I'm willing to hold some things in tension.
If arguments are bad or they need to be improved, then they're bad and need to be improved. I'm not telling everybody to conclude what I'm concluding. I'm trying to push the discussion forward.
The fact that there's no more obvious evidence for God or resurrection doesn't mean that there's no evidence at all. On the other hand, we already have enough evidence, right, to conclude that God exists, right?
We don't have enough evidence to conclude a resurrection or that God exists. Why not just give up on arguments? Arguments aren't what convinced Dr. Allison to believe.
So I don't find the philosophical discussions of miracles to be very interesting. For me, it is an empirical question. And for me, Gregory of Nyssa was on target, that we tend to decide what's possible through our own experience. So I don't know what your hearers are going to do with this, but my experience has been exceedingly strange. So has the experience of members of my immediate family. So let me just say a couple of things here. Once, I believe that twice. And by the way, I don't think anyone should believe me. You really shouldn't. But I believe that twice. I'm firmly convinced that twice I saw the future.
Dr. Allison warns against the intellectual inertia of Christian apologetics.
I want to quote a paragraph out of your 2005 book, Resurrecting Jesus, that illustrates this. Quote, we may justly suspect that many or even most New Testament scholars hold the view of Jesus that they do because it was instilled at them at a young age by their education. And once they came to see things a certain way, they found it difficult to change their minds. Intellectual inertia can be obstinate. Ask yourself, can you name any important historians of Jesus whose views in their 50s or 60s were radically different from their views in their 20s or 30s? If in the near future someone truly demonstrates that my sort of Jesus cannot be the historical Jesus, others would no doubt be quicker than me to home in on the truth. I would have to reconfigure my entire reconstruction of early Christianity, a task requiring courage and prolonged intellectual effort. Maybe I would not be up to it. I find this troubling. End quote. I just really appreciate you saying that, because it's true. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying there.
Well, so this is scary. It's disturbing. But I'm not a cynic here. So if I were a total cynic, there'd be no point in calling attention to this fact. I call attention to this fact so that we can be aware of it and try to do a better job. We have the magical ability to change our minds if we work at it, and if we're open, and if we're honest, we pay attention to evidence. And I've seen this in my own life. So on this little podcast, if anybody was paying attention, they know that my view of John and the Synoptics is not the same that it was 40 years ago. And that was very painful to change my mind. It actually renders a number of my arguments in a lot of my books irrelevant, right? And now I'm thinking about this multiple attestation business. I don't know where it goes, but it's very unsettling. I changed my view about one of the arguments for the early tomb in this new book. I abandoned something I argued at length earlier. Bart Ehrman had said something in response, and I thought, yeah, Bart's right here. I need to get rid of this. This is not a good argument. So it is possible. It's possible to change your mind.
If I may, allow me to say amen, Dr. Allison. If it's not a good argument, get rid of it. It is possible to change your mind. To continue on that quest, why not tap on the Paulogia versus Jesus Resurrection playlist thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Later.